Hi, I'm Jay Thomas, and welcome to the first episode of the Bald Tires Podcast. This week, we're talking about a class of vehicle that is one of my favorites, and they go by many names. Land yachts, dinosaurs, gas guzzlers, a living room on wheels. We're talking velour, wood trim, vinyl tops, and fender skirts. The American personal luxury vehicle. Right now, joining me, a great friend of mine, Tim Roden, and he's an expert in this field. He's had a huge collection of vehicles, and they've pretty much all been American personal luxury vehicles. We're talking Cadillacs, Buicks, Lincolns, Mercurys, Chryslers, and we're going to go over Tim's top 5 of all the cars he's owned. I'm Jay Thomas, and this is the Bald Tires Podcast, because when you make great memories, you make bald tires. So I'm joined by Tim Roden. He's a good friend of mine. I've gotten to know Tim because we're interested in the same stuff. We like the same cars. We met a few years ago. I had just gotten my 1969 Buick Electra, and I think I had showed up. Where did we meet, Tim? You remember the first time?
It seems to me we met at Pike Lake, and I had a triple black Lincoln Continental, and you had that Buick that you had bought from Brad Smith.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and you were there when that vehicle got bought at auction, right?
I was standing right beside Brad when he bought that car.
And then Brad had it, and I found it online. In fact, I found a Lincoln online that I was kind of looking at. And we were just talking about this before, but it was a 71. What was it, Mark? What was that year?
It was a Mark III. It was a 1971 Mark III.
It was burgundy, really beautiful, but it had been restored, what I'd call restored.
Right.
Repainted. But somebody had taken it apart pretty far.
There was a whole photo album of that car, and they had documented the restoration, and it was a frame off. They took absolutely everything apart, including all the wiring.
That's what freaked me out, because when I was kind of looking at it, and it was like it met all of my requirements. So just a precursor to this, we're talking about what are the things I wanted in a car, and it's the same things you want in a car. And I've always had this dream list, and I wish I could find a car that had it all. But I wanted fender skirts. I wanted like a Continental kit. I wanted a vinyl roof. I wanted hideaway headlights, cornering lamps. I wanted the little signal light indicators that mount on the top of the fenders. And that had it all.
Yep.
It did. Except I started looking in the trunk, and the wiring was not great because it had been put back together with butt connectors. And I've had plenty of wiring experiences where those things, like the connection goes bad, and that's it. Like, it doesn't work anymore.
Something doesn't work, and then you end up chasing a wire for a week. And
Totally. So anyways, I've known Tim. That's a long story, but I've known Tim for now 4 or 5 years, right? That's a while ago.
4 or 5 years, yeah.
And in the meantime, I've had my 1969 Buick Electra, the one I got from Brad Smith, and Tim's had a dozen cars.
Well, I might have had 5 or 6 cars in the last 5 or 6 years, but a dozen maybe not. I don't know.
I don't know. We might be able to count. I love talking with Tim because every time I see him, a couple months apart, the winter goes by and we don't get to talk to each other because the car show season's off or something like that. And then he's got something new, or he fires me a text and he's in Alberta picking something up. And you have this ability, Tim, to find cars that are just perfect. And I can't figure out how you do it, because you always find something that just has an amazing story, or it's in immaculate shape. How do you do that?
Well, typically I fall backwards into deals like that. I don't usually go out searching for a car because, as Murphy's Law would dictate, when you're out looking for something, you're never going to find what you're looking for. You were just talking about that. And but when you're not looking for something, that's when they show up. So that's why I typically own 3 or 4 cars at a time, because I'll find something that it's not like I can't, not have it. I just don't want anyone else to have it. So that's why I buy them.
They find you.
They do. They find me. I've been sought out by many, many cars.
I believe in this. I believe, call me crazy, but maybe it's, I don't know what it is, the universe. Let's just call it the universe,
Right.
Certain things are meant to happen certain ways, and sometimes those objects find you for a reason. And I feel the same way. There's things that have come to me that I haven't really gone out looking for, and all of a sudden, that's exactly what I need,
Yeah.
But you have a way, like I say, or these things have a way of finding you. And there are these immaculate one-owner vehicles, low kilometers, options to the hilt with a great story and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, for sure. And once you've bought a few of them, you kind of get to be known, amongst the car circles. We're both involved in a few car clubs. And every so often a deal will come up It just came up for me again in January. Look what I found. Another member of one of our car clubs as a contractor was working at a condo in downtown Saskatoon and stumbled upon a Cadillac sitting in the underground parking with 2 inches of dust sitting on top of it. 4 flat tires, have been sitting there for 10 years. One owner car, spent most of its winters in Arizona in just beautiful shape, but you couldn't really tell underneath all of the dirt and the dust that was on top of it. So he did most of the work. He got air in the tires, he got it running, he cleaned it all up, and then I took it from there. He called me, we went over, and it was a good excuse to have a visit. So we had a nice visit in his garage. I looked at this car and, basically in my mind decided to buy it right there on the spot without even hearing it run. And I did. So
this was the Cadillac you just recently had.
I just recently had this Cadillac.
What was it? It was a 90...
It was a 1992 Cadillac Fleetwood Coupe, a 2-door. So this car had most of the parameters you were looking for. It had the turn signal indicators on the fender. It had fender skirts. It had a vinyl top.
Yep.
It did not have hideaway headlights, but it was a fairly modern car in that it had fuel injection.
Yep, that's right.
It was front-wheel drive and uber plush. Very, very plush.
Yeah. Like it was, and then once you got all the dirt out of it, it was like in really good shape too.
Oh, it was in wonderful, wonderful shape. That car only had 153,000 kilometers on it. So for a 1992 car that spent a lot of time traveling between Saskatoon and Phoenix, it was in really nice shape.
Those are nice roads on the way to that destination,
yes,
right? Like we're not talking gravel that it's been going down, right?
No gravel. The car was clean. Underneath, it was cleaner underneath than it was on the top.
So did this owner they had stopped driving and they were ready to sell it already?
I don't really recall the story, and neither did the fella I bought the car from either. He tried to get the story, but it was such a typical story of an old car. It was owned by old people who owned it for a very, very long time until one of them got sick, and then it turned into an estate deal. So the car ended up languishing for a long, long time while an estate was settled, and then it was finally able to be purchased by someone.
Time to go.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, for
Makes
sure.
sense. Okay, so how many cars do you think you've owned? Since you were 16?
Well, I did.
Do you have like a number?
When the pandemic started, there was a little thing on Facebook that was a bit of a challenge. If you could name all of the cars that you've owned, and I had a bit of a list, and of course I have a photo album.
Yeah.
And I was over 40, so it was about 45 cars I think I've owned since I started driving, and so that's 45.
That's amazing. Okay, let's talk about the first one. What was your first car?
My first car was a 1977 Mercury Marquis. I had been shopping for a car. Me and my dad have the same interest. My dad loves old cars also.
Yeah.
So we were out shopping over my first car. Now, when I was shopping for my first car, I was 18. It was 1985. So a 1977 Mercury was not an old car, but it was an old car. It was a neighbor's car, and he was an employee of SaskTel. So back in the day, they had company cars. The managers did. And he bought the car from the company and had it repainted because the top of the car was white and the top of the car was blue.
Yeah.
The sides of the car were white, and there was a great big reflective yellow stripe along this whole side of the car and SaskTel in letters on the door. And I remember the car when it was his company car, and then when he bought it, he had it painted poorly because you could make out the outline of SaskTel through the paint and the outline of the side mark. And I figured I could fix that with some turtle wax, and I never did. I just made it shiny and more noticeable. But that was my first car, Jay.
That was your first car?
That was my first car, yeah.
So what did you take your license in?
I took my license in a 1980 Oldsmobile Custom Cruiser station wagon.
That's awesome.
It was my dad's company car,
Yeah? And the funny thing is, you kind of have, in a sort of way, both of these cars again right now, or very close to it.
I do. I got my driver's license in 1983. I'm a huge fan of Oldsmobiles, and I think that goes back to me actually accomplishing getting my driver's license, and it was in this 1980 Olds station wagon. My dad previously had a 77 Olds Delta 88, and just the dash layout and everything just takes me back to those good old times of, when I got my license and I was 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. So I've really had a penchant for that. And I currently own, I think, one of the better 1983 the year I got my license, and
Yeah.
it's a Delta 88 Oldsmobile, and I absolutely love it.
You know, the funny thing is that, again, there's these funny similarities that Tim and I have figured out is that, you know, for example, we're both like sort of the same taste in cars. You have a fascination with the Titanic, the ship.
Yes.
I did too as a kid, and I'm still always interested in new research and things like that, you know. So, and that Oldsmobile you talked about, that is the Olds, an 84 Olds, because it was 85 they changed the body, right? 84 was still...
85, they changed 86. They went to front-wheel drive in 1986,
Right,
a
so
Delta 88.
my grandparents had an 84 Olds Delta 88.
Mm-hmm.
That's when they had the amber turn signals.
That's right.
Right, on the back. But that's the car that I grew up in, riding around in. So you were taking your license in it, but I was also a kid in almost the same car. And I can remember my grandmother, they lived in Cudworth, Saskatchewan, my grandparents. Mm-hmm. I remember her coming to the city and picking me up for the weekend, or maybe me and my sister, but I was really young. And young enough that, you know, back then you could let kids sit in the front seat, right? And I'd be in the front seat, and my grandmother would be driving the car. And at that point, she was really only in her late 50s, early 60s. So, you know, she wasn't an old lady yet at all. But I specifically remember sitting in those big, plush, overstuffed velour seats, blue velour seats. And that dashboard, if anybody knows this car, it sort of slants up at you, kind of from the bottom, right?
Yes, it does, yeah.
And everything is sort of laid out in a sort of vertical style in a lot of ways. The vents, they're kind of vertical and long. And same thing with the glove box. It sort of comes up at you at a strange angle. And on your, you know, the door, and I can remember this all from my head. I mean, I haven't been one of these cars in years. But, you know, there's sort of a square armrest and a kind of a handle that you use to pull the door shut.
Yep.
Right? Kind of like a coach handle almost.
A nice little leather strap. Yeah.
Exactly. But I remember sitting in that car, riding with her, you know, many weekends in a row, and just falling in love with it. And I think that's probably one of the cars that are one of the reasons why I like the cars that I like today.
Right.
And I remember the ride. You know, I can remember, it's so funny how those things, when you're an early kid or even a teenager, they stick with you. The sounds and the feelings. You know, like, I bet you and I can't remember what we were even doing last week, but I can remember exactly the sound of the turn signal in that Oldsmobile.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
When the turn signal flasher would be on, or, you know, what it sounded like and how it felt.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think those things drive you, and they stick with you, and they kind of form who you sort of become, you know?
Well, they kind of do. You're absolutely right. That Oldsmobile, I mean, I'm on a Facebook, within Facebook group, an Oldsmobile appreciation group. Of the 40 cars I've owned, I think 7 or 8 of them have been Oldsmobiles, and they've all been that B-body class. You know, 77, I've had a 78 Olds Regency. I had an 84 Olds Regency Coupe. I had a 79 Delta 88. I had another 79 Delta 8, and I've had 2 83 Delta 88s. And I had a 1992 Cutlass briefly.
That's awesome. Tell me a bit more. We're going to put, by the way, pictures up of some of Tim's cars. I'm going to bug him for some pictures, and we'll get them up on my Facebook page, and you'll find them at jthomasauto.ca as well, along with this podcast. But the 83 you've got right now, that's got a cool story too.
Yeah, that car was, I bought it from the son of the original owner. They purchased the car brand new in 1983, and then they used the car, but very, very sparingly. And the car was always kept inside, and his dad waxed it, cleaned it. The kids weren't allowed to eat in the car.
Yep.
And but they did use it. They used it for traveling, and he drove it every year. Unfortunately, his father had gotten sick, and had eventually passed away. And then I had the car in my driveway shortly after I purchased it, and his mother had recently moved into another condo just across the street from me.
Oh, no way.
And in passing, she walked by and said, "I think that's my car. Did you buy this car from so-and-so?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I did." She said, "That's my car." So she filled me in on the whole story of that car. They had actually bought a car in 1983 at SMP. There was a terrible storm, a thunderstorm in the summer, that had wiped out every car with hail.
Yeah.
So they went in and saw their brand new car, and it was covered in hail dents, and her husband didn't want it. He said he didn't want anything that was going to be repainted. So the salesman talked him into, leaving their deposit because they had more of them coming in, and they ended up buying this car. So this car was fresh off of the truck, No one had test driven it except for the mechanic doing the PDI.
Yep.
And then they took delivery of it the very next day. So this was not a car that sat on a lot or in a showroom or anything. This was a fresh delivery right from the factory, right into their garage where it stayed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. And then did they even winter drive it?
I don't think so. This car has got absolutely no rust on it under the doors or anywhere else. And I bought it because it was an 83 Delta 88 and I just had to have it.
Yeah.
But I only really started to look the car thoroughly over after I had purchased it, just like all of us do.
Yeah.
You'd buy it. I took it for a test drive and kind of looked around it, and it needed stuff. The power antenna didn't work, and the white wall tires were dirty and stuff, but the car was really clean, and his son had really looked after it since his father had passed away also.
Right.
And, I thought, well, I could really work with this, and the price was right, so I bought it. But as I went over the car, it just got better and better and better. There isn't one piece on that car that's ever been repainted.
It's completely original.
Completely original, and not a ding or dent or mark on it. The vinyl top is in, perfect shape. The interior's in perfect shape. Never been smoked in. He put a really nice aftermarket CB radio into it. It's still in there. A realistic from probably Radio Shack back in the day, and it's got a big whip antenna in the trunk. So,
what's amazing about that, and I'm not sure. Maybe I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You work for a dealership in town here, a Chevy dealership. Do you think there are still people around who do that, who buy a car and they simply drive it a little bit and keep it in the garage? I mean a new car now today, a 2021 whatever. Do you think there's anybody left who does that?
You know what? Yes, there is.
Yeah.
And because I know them, because they're very picky with their cars, and I'm the guy they see because I run the detail shop.
Okay.
So they will come and see me for periodic things. They like to get their car waxed once a year, and they'll typically keep a car for about 10 years. But I have seen the odd car that has come in on trade, and this is typically a car that you'll never see after it leaves the dealership because they'll look after it themselves, and they'll come in beautiful shape. 2 years ago, we had a 1990, I think 4 or 5, Monte Carlo traded in.
Oh.
It was white and low kilometers. They bought it brand new there at the dealership, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful one-owner car. We sold it right away. It didn't go on a lot. I mean, there were people waiting in the wings to buy that car.
Right now, I'm with Tim Roden. He's a friend of mine. He works at one of the dealerships in Saskatoon and runs the detail shop, among other things that you do there.
Yep.
You've had like 40 plus cars. Do you think you've got a top 5?
I certainly have a top 5 that I wished I hadn't sold.
Okay.
And one that I still have that I've owned for 25 years, going on 30.
Yeah.
And it's sitting in my driveway. And that's likely my favorite car. I've had many opportunities to sell it over the years, and I just can't bring myself to do it.
Okay, then that's confirmation. So because there are cars that I've seen you get that you've loved and that are amazing, and you've sold them, but you've never sold that one.
I've never sold that one. That's the one I keep.
Okay, so it is
that's a 1996 Chevrolet Impala SS.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was reading a Car and Driver magazine article, and it was talking about vehicles actually appreciating in value. And do you know that was one of the ones that was on the list for up-and-comers, ones that are now worth more than they were even worth brand new.
Oh, wow.
And the Impala and 96 Impala SS was on that list.
Yeah.
So you're not the only one who thinks it's a cool car,
Well, that's great. I loved them when they first came out. The original advertising for those cars was just a simple profile of the car in picture, and then just in print underneath it said, "Lord Vader, your car is ready." And that absolutely sold me. It's like, I've got to even just see one of these things.
Yeah.
And, my dad in the 1990s, my dad was a senior executive who bought a lot of cars for his job. And, one of the things that he got with his job was a company car. And he ordered that car shortly before he retired. I can remember him asking me, I'm going to order one of my last company cars. I said, if you're able to order an Impala SS, order it. And I will start saving right now, and I'll just buy it from you when it's time for you to turn it in. I'll just buy it. So he said, okay. So we made a deal, And he bought that car as a company car. He was able to get one because they were extremely hard to get.
Yeah.
When they were new. But because of his job, I think he was able to swing a deal, and he got one and ordered it brand new. I can remember the car being delivered. I went with him to the dealership that delivered it to him, and we went into their service drive-through. It was in December. It was in the winter of all times.
Okay.
Winter time. It was just before Christmas of 95, and he picked up this 96 Impala SS, and it was brand new, all clean. They had it all cleaned up. It was just gorgeous. So, and he drove it out of there, and I can remember him starting it for the first time, and I was standing behind it, and they had kind of a detuned exhaust or whatever, but you could tell it was something special.
So for those who don't necessarily know, give us a rundown on what makes up an Impala SS. Like, what is it actually made out of?
Well, an Impala SS is a Caprice Classic, so it's a police car. Or a taxi cab is what most people know them as. But back in the day, Caprice Classics were still sold. They still sold station wagons.
That's right.
It had an LT1 V8 5.7 liter engine, so a good old 350 engine in it, and it's a body on frame. 1996 was the last year the GM made body on frame cars.
Right.
The Buick Roadmaster, the Cadillac Fleetwood, the Caprice Classic, and the Impala SS all shared the exact same platform and the same powertrain, the 260 horsepower LT1 V8 engine. And but this one was ordered all black. It had bucket seats. It's the only year it had a console shift.
Yeah.
So, and you know what? My dad used it as a company car for 1 year, and then I bought it. And I moved the car back to Calgary, where I was currently living. And I kept the car with me in Calgary until I moved back to Saskatoon, and I just can never bring myself to sell it. I just kept it, and I maintained it, and I drive it every year. It's got probably 200 and some thousand kilometers on it by now.
That many?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because you'll see pictures if you go to jthomasauto.ca of this thing. It is practically flawless. It really is. For its year, it is practically flawless.
Don't forget I run a detail shop.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, you do. Of course you do. Yeah. So, I mean, you can make anything look perfect, but I would never have guessed it was that many kilometers at all.
It is. The odometer is the old LCD style with it blinked out. And I don't really know the true mileage on the car because that's one of the only things that doesn't work is the odometer.
Aw, too bad.
It's a digital odometer on an analog gauge. And for some strange reason, they just made them like that. The numbers went out a number of years ago, and I did have it fixed with the authentic mileage on it. I think it was about 150,000 kilometers, if I remember, but it only lasted a year, and it was quite expensive to send it off and get it fixed. So I figure it's probably around 200,000 by now that's on it. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, and it's been an excellent car. You know, I've never had to recharge the air conditioning in it. It's a 96. I've only put a few batteries in it. Mind you, I store it in the winter and take the battery out and everything else, and it's doted on. But in the summer when I'm driving it, I take it to the lake. I'll make a dozen trips back and forth to Greenwater. Highway trips on Saskatchewan highways with it. It just goes. It's just a great car. The power locks work. Everything works except the odometer.
So that's probably, we could almost call that car number one. Like that's almost the flagship of your collection, the one you're not selling.
That's the top dog in my fleet.
In your fleet. Okay, yep. So if we had to go to the next one, if we were doing the top five, what would be your next favorite car that you've had?
The next one that I had that I really loved was an Oldsmobile.
Okay.
I love my Oldsmobiles, and this was a 1984 Regency two-door, and it was bought new in Regina, and it was the typical story of the family who owned it for 30 years. Somebody died, and the car was purchased from an estate by a friend of mine.
Okay.
And he kept the car for about 10 years, but he had kept it on a farm outside. And so the car needed a little bit of work on the paint to bring the paint back and everything else, but the interior in the car was absolutely perfect. And it really ran nice, 307 V8. It was the last year they made that car on a rear-wheel drive platform.
Right.
And triple burgundy. Just had to have it. Burgundy, Olds 98, just like Fargo, you know. So I bought that car, and when I sold it to a friend of mine, but I lamented selling that car because it was just so pure and original and clean. It really was nice. It was never on a gravel road. You could pull up the mats underneath the trunk and look inside the fender. It wasn't even any dust back there. It looked like it was just built.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
Okay.
beautiful car.
That's number 2. What's number 3?
Number 3, well, we'll go down the list here, and that was a triple black 1978 Lincoln Town Coupe. That was a very special car for me because one of my favorite customers in the whole world, he bought that car brand new, and that had a really big backstory. He ordered the car new, and he wanted a triple black car because his dad always bought black cars. The salesman he bought the car from tried to talk him out of it. Wanted him to buy a car that they already had in stock. They didn't want to have to order one.
Of course.
Triple black, you're going to look like a gangster. We'll never be able to resell it, blah, blah, blah. So he said, well, that's what I want. You're either going to sell it to me or I'll just buy one somewhere else. So they ended up ordering this car for him. Black vinyl top on a black car with black leather interior. In 1978, when the popular colors were yellows and browns with white vinyl tops and stuff, he had this triple black one. He owned that car for 30 years simply to spite the salesman who sold it to him. And he bought a new truck from us every 5 years. So I got to know him really well. And he was so meticulous and fussy. If you think I'm fussy and you're fussy with cars, this guy was really fussy. Every 5 years gets a black truck, and I went over that truck with a fine-tooth comb, making sure there wasn't a mark or anything on it.
Yeah.
And out of a regular conversation about 10 years ago, he told me he had this Lincoln Town Coupe. And the reason being was that I was at the time driving a 78 Lincoln Town car. He said, whose Lincoln is that? I said, it's mine. I've got one of those in my garage. And I couldn't believe it. And then I really couldn't believe when he said it was black. And one thing led to another. And about 5 or 6 years after that conversation, I ended up with the car. And I absolutely loved it because I knew how fussy he was with that car. And that's one of the ones also. I should have never sold that car because I'll never have another one.
Well, and that's the one you had when I met you. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It had monogrammed door plates.
Yes.
Right?
It did.
It had initials. Was that something you ordered from the factory? Or was it like a dealership installed accessory or something?
I'm not sure if the dealer installed those or if the factory installed those. But it was definitely a vanity thing. It was very popular in the 70s, especially on luxury cars, to get your initials. I've seen cars in the past too with an actual plaque that has your name engraved in it. And those would come from the factory.
Right. I mean, this one, though, it wasn't just a sticker or, that's like your name stuck on there. It was a stainless steel plate or chromed plate.
Oh, yeah.
With number or with letters set into it.
It was a plaque, and that thing was riveted to the door.
Yeah.
It wasn't glued on it. It was riveted onto the door with his initials in it.
Now, that Lincoln also featured opera windows, right? Mm-hmm. Those oval-shaped opera windows that were kind of in the back.
Yeah.
But there was another addition, though, right? You've shown me collector windows you've got in storage that belonged to that car, right?
Yeah, so in 78, you could also buy a Mark V, and that was the more expensive of the two cars. And, it's funny because the fella who owned the car, ordered the car new, he wanted a Mark V. That's what he was shopping for, was a Mark V. He wanted a triple black Mark V. But in the 70s, him and his wife were quite avid skiers, and they used to make trips out to Fernie every year to go skiing.
Okay.
And he brought his skis in from his, he lived down in Cabri and brought his skis in just to make sure that everything would fit and everything. And came to the Ford stores, and lo and behold, the skis and equipment would not fit in the trunk of a Mark V. If you've ever seen a Mark V, it's kind of like a Cadillac Eldorado. They're like a Buffalo. Everything is up front with a very short, stubby trunk.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So nothing would fit in the trunk of this car. So the salesman had, coaxed him and said, well, you can get a full-size car and you can still get them in a two-door, because he wanted a two-door. And that's why he ordered the Town Coupe instead of a Mark V.
Which one would have been higher in the hierarchy of Lincoln's models at the time?
A Mark V.
A Mark V.
Yes.
But the Town Coupe was actually a bigger full-size car.
It was a bigger full-size car, but it cost less money.
Okay. So that's similar to what, for example, I know of the history of my car. 69 Buick Electra 225 was the biggest car, but it wasn't the most expensive.
Right.
The most expensive was the Riviera.
Right.
That was, even though it wasn't quite as big, and it was mechanically vastly different in many ways than the Electra.
Right.
But
yeah, but a significantly smaller car.
Significantly smaller car.
Different styling and more geared toward the personal luxury market.
Yes.
Which was huge in the 70s.
That's what ruled the world, right?
Yep.
I mean, that was I've read some articles. This is sort of a tangent, but I read some articles about how when we went from muscle cars and that was the trend in the 60s and into the 70s. But when the fuel crisis hit in the early 70s, was it 73?
73, the oil
right?
embargo.
Oil
the first
embargo.
one. Yeah.
That, there had to be this swing, and it was almost a deliberate swing into personal luxury because they had to sort of push buyers' attention away from big horsepower numbers to something else that appeased them, because all of a sudden they had to make up, these EPA regulations, and they had to meet fuel economy numbers, and it bogged, engines right down. All of a sudden, a 500 horsepower engine was only making 230 horsepower after, emissions standards, the catalytic converter came into effect, and all the other things. So it was actually almost like a deliberate push into sort of a different direction.
Absolutely. It absolutely was. The governments in the early 1970s, you got to remember there was insurance companies were starting to complain about high horsepowers. Insurance rates, of course, were going up and up and up on high horsepower cars. And then there was something called the corporate average fuel economy standard set by the U.S. government. They referred to it as CAFE.
Yes.
And auto manufacturers were now forced to make cars more fuel efficient and better for the environment. So they started these big V8 engines in the 1970s were getting choked up and detuned with all these emission controls.
Right.
Having to be made to run on unleaded fuel. The advent of catalytic converters and all this stuff happened in around the same time that the personal luxury cars got so popular. And of course, that's one of the reasons why they had to, get that crowd that was buying the two-door sports cars into something different.
Yeah, it's almost a distraction.
Almost a distraction,
right? Because if you keep selling sports cars, but they're not really sports cars anymore,
right?
What have you got?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
nothing.
You just have a regular two-door car.
Yeah, that doesn't do anything.
So you have to make it somewhat appealing. So, of course, in the 1970s, you had the padded vinyl tops. And
wood grain
everywhere, pinstripes everywhere, wide white wall tires.
What was,
waffle weave.
The Cordoba, Corinthian leather.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Herb Tarlick from WKRP in Cincinnati, the Corinthian leather.
And go figure, people are collecting. Chrysler Cordobas are now getting collectible, and some of the nicer examples are starting to get quite expensive.
They are, yeah.
Yeah. That's on my bucket list. I would love to own a beautiful Chrysler Cordoba.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I guess coming back to where we were sort of left off from, though, is that big Lincoln, he bought it because his skis fit into it.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
This previous owner, this one owner, and he ended up with just keeping it for forever. And again, keeping it so perfectly. It was such an immaculate car.
He did. That car was absolutely gorgeous when I bought it. I went and looked at it, and it was another one. I just had to have it. Just like this Blue Olds, I just had to have that one.
Okay, so I think that's number 3.
That's number 3.
What's number 4?
Number 4 is going to surprise a lot of people. It's going to really disappoint my dad because he hated it. But it was a 1973 Chrysler New Yorker Brougham.
Oh.
A lot of people considered it a big, ugly tank, but I absolutely loved it. That car had the best ride. It was the most reliable car. At the time, when I bought that car, that was 20 years ago when I bought that car. It was already all rusted out. It had virtually everything that you were looking for in a car. It had a vinyl top. It had fender skirts, which had since rusted so badly that you couldn't attach them to the car anymore. It was very, very rusty. I bought the car from a ballet instructor in Saskatoon for $800. And
okay.
It was gold. It had this white vinyl top. I thought the price was right, and it already had studded rear, tires on it. So I bought it. And I thought, well, I'll just drive it until something goes wrong with it. Because I thought, what the heck, for $800, why not? And it was heavy. It blew good heat when I test drove it. Everything seemed to work when I test drove it. And I kept waiting and waiting for something to go wrong with that car, and it never did. Everything worked in that car. It was a beautiful car. It was a 4-door hardtop. In fact, I was so confident with that car that I started making trips with it back and forth to the lake in the dead of winter.
Really?
And it ran just fine. It never let me down once.
So when you say rusty, I mean, there's people, I'm assuming you're not meaning like holes through the floor rusty, not like that. I just mean some surface rust, some edge rust, things like that.
Well, it had some surface rust, but the rust in the rear back, those were unit body cars, so very difficult to repair, I think. But, if you were driving on wet freeways and highways, you wanted to put your suitcase in the back seat because it was going to get wet in the trunk.
Okay, so it was that bad.
Yeah, it was that bad.
I'm surprised. I've never seen you own a car that even had a blemish on it. So I'm surprised you even went for something like that.
You know what? I lived at home then briefly for a while, and I drove this thing into the driveway, and my dad just, he put his hands in his face and he just shook his head and said, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I said, well, look it was only $800. It's just a great car, and it seems to run fine. It had a 440. And, I made a few road trips with that car, Jay, and, you could sit there and just cruise with it at 80 miles an hour, and it just tracked absolutely smooth. You could let it go with the steering wheel, and it would just drive itself.
I knew a guy in high school who had one of these things. I think it was a similar year. And he basically worked in high school just to put gas in the thing.
Yeah.
I suppose when you're talking, gas was probably a little bit more, cheaper. But,
yeah,
man, when I was in high school, that's already just about 20 years ago, too, for me.
Yeah.
But he just worked to put gas in it because it was a complete hog.
Yeah. This was a hog on gas too. Don't get me wrong, it was still a big gas guzzler, but comfortable. The car also was missing. It didn't have tilt. A lot of people are so used to having that tilt steering column. This car didn't have tilt, but it had everything else: power windows, seats, door locks, all of the other amenities. It was a hard top, so when you put all four windows down, there was no pillar in the middle. So it was very, very unique in that way. The air conditioning worked perfectly. And the seats were so comfortable that even on long road trips, I can remember this to this day. My legs or back or nothing ever got sore driving that car. And it floated, it sopped up the bumps. It was just a really nice, smooth ride. And I tell you, if I could find a really, really nice shape 72 or 3 New Yorker again with no rust,
you'd do it.
I would do it.
So what happened to that car?
I sold it to a fellow who was he was a photographer, and he used to drive around to schools and take pictures, class pictures at schools. That was his job. And he wanted a car big enough for all of his equipment in the trunk. And I told him when he bought that car, I said, if you ever want to sell that car, phone me first. And he did about 5 years later, and I bought it back. I owned that car twice.
But hey, that's not the first car you've owned more than once, though.
No, I've owned that car twice. And I owned another Chrysler New Yorker. I owned that same car 3 times.
Is that the one you had most recently?
Most recently, yeah. That was a newer car. It was a 93, so it was kind of a K car version of a New Yorker.
Right, yeah, the smaller front-wheel drive thing. But you had that 3 times.
Again, there was nothing wrong with it. It came in at high mileage on it. It came in on trade at the dealership. And I was looking for a winter beater, and I just checked it out real quick, and I opened the door, and I just about dropped dead from the smell. And that was the reason that the customer traded the car. They couldn't stand the smell in it anymore. And it was an older couple, I believe they're from Nipawin. And I don't know, the scalloped potato spilt over in the trunk one Easter, and they could never clean it out. They took it to all these cleanup shops, and they tried shampooing it out themselves, but they never took the carpet out of the trunk. Oh yeah. So I bought the car. It was really cheap. And when I bought that car, first thing I did, I had to find the source of the smell. Because working in the detail industry, there's going to be a source somewhere, a mouse nest or something.
Yeah.
This had a really bad rotten milk type. Ugh, it was just awful. And that velour, it had enough velour in that car to please a sheik. And it was just permeated the whole thing. So I shampooed that entire car. And I pulled out the trunk carpet, and there it was. And it was a lump of black something or other. Oh, my God. So I treated that car with chlorine, ozone, any poisonous gas I could get my hands on. I threw in the trunk of that thing. But I cleaned it all out. And you know what? I drove that car for 2 years. It was my winter car for 2 years. I sold it to my girlfriend's mother at the time, and she drove the car for 5 years. And I bought it back from her, and I kept it for another year. And then I sold it to one of my employees, who kept it. He cleaned it all up, and then he had plans to ship it to the Philippines.
Wow.
So one thing happened after another. The car never did get shipped, and I ended up buying it back from him just this past winter.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
and and it's gone again, though.
Well, I bought it for another fellow that I work with, and he was looking for an older, cheaper car for his mother-in-law. And she loves it. And that's another Chrysler New Yorker. I never had a problem with that car. Everything worked, and the car ran and drove just beautifully.
That's really cool. Okay. How are we at number 5, do you think? I think number 4 was the first Chrysler New Yorker that you talked about, right?
Yep.
What's number 5, top 5, or the fifth car that got away?
Well, the fifth car that got away, I really had to think about this one.
I think I know the answer.
I've got a bunch of ties. Well, you might be surprised by the answer. Number 5 might be... It's either going to be the current car that I own, this 83 Delta 88, because I got my driver's license in 1983 in an Oldsmobile.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why I bought this car. But the other reason is that my very first car was a Mercury Marquis, and my current car that's sitting in the garage is a 78 Mercury Marquis. So it's the same car as the very first car that I owned.
Now, this is the one that you told us about that was painted, the Sastel car.
Yes,
right?
The Sastel car that was painted. It was a base car. So I pined for like the fully loaded Grand Marquis, but that was way out of my price range. I couldn't afford anything like that at the time. So this was a base Mercury Marquis. It had a 400 engine in it. It had a bench seat. It had air conditioning and aftermarket cruise control. It didn't have any other options. It had the manual lever to slide that huge bench seat forward and backward. AM only radio. The aftermarket cruise control didn't work, and it was strapped on with zip ties onto the turn signal.
Oh, great, yeah.
No tilt. So you basically sat there and drove it like a bus driver would drive a bus. And it was this hideous blue with, I shouldn't say hideous. I actually liked the color of it. And it had a white vinyl top and nice hubcaps. I mean, it really cleaned up like a nice car.
But the one that's in the garage right now
That's
is spectacular.
That is an extra lettuce and tomato version of the exact same car. It's the same car. It looks exactly the same as my very first car, except it's a two-door. It's a Grand Marquis.
Yep.
It's absolutely loaded with every option you can think of. The leather seats. It really is nice. And
there's pictures of this at jthomasauto.ca on Facebook as well. Go check it out. It's the green machine. It really is. It's what you'd call triple green, really, right?
It is. It's triple green.
A green vinyl roof, a beautiful emerald green exterior, and sort of two-tone green leather seats.
Right.
Green carpet, the whole thing's green inside, really, right? I mean...
Except for all the wood application, which really gives it a rainforest kind of atmosphere sitting in there. You're almost looking for the mosquitoes to swat.
Okay, but seriously, that car, I mean, I just stuck my head on it before we started this. It smells like leather. Old cars usually kind of have a smell. That car doesn't smell. It is perfect. It really is.
It's a nice car. There's only 74,000 kilometers on it. And I bought that from another friend of mine up in Prince Albert. And the car was sold brand new at Arcade Motors in PA, which is now called Lakeland Ford.
Yep.
And it was a one owner for 20 years. And then another person bought it and he owned it for another 10 or 15 years. And then this fella bought it. And it was always just treated with respect and, taken out on sunny days and driven to church and, basically driven to car shows and driven to the golf course and taken to the lake a few times a year.
Which is amazing. So you're the fourth owner of that car.
Yeah.
And that car has been lucky enough its entire life to find those kind of people to look after it. Because for every story that we're talking about like this, there's also a sad ending for several cars where they were one-owner cars. They were beautifully kept, looked after.
Yep.
They made it into an estate sale. They were picked up. And they went either to the demolition derby straight away, or they were just, I don't know, you could say had the hell driven right out of them, right?
Wrecked.
I mean, they were wrecked. They went from being practically pristine and perfect to just about destroyed, probably within a number of years.
Well, I've owned a few cars that's been their fate since I've sold them. It's too bad a guy spends all that effort and time on something like that to see it get wrecked. But after all, it is a car.
I guess I watched Herbie the Love Bug and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang too many times as a kid, because you start to feel in a sort of way like you have a connection with these things. I know that's completely insane, but when you devote that much time and effort and resources to something, you really kind of do begin to fall in love with it. That's why there's been some cars you've had that I've been surprised you got rid of. What was that Cadillac?
Well, that Cadillac was an 87 Cadillac Brougham. A lot of people call them Fleetwoods, but this was called a Brougham d'Elegance. It was a full-size rear drive car. I bought this car from a friend of mine who had bought one of my cars, just like you. I had met him at a car show. I had a beautiful Oldsmobile Regency at the time, camel-colored four-door 1978 Regency, and he fell in love with that car. And at the time, I was thinking of getting something a little bit different. So just like everybody who's in the old car hobby, storage is always an issue.
Yeah.
And if you want to experience a bunch of different cars in your life, you're going to have to part with them from time to time. So that 98 I hated parting with, but I met the right person that day. And he was so fussy, and he seemed like such a really nice guy, genuine guy. He gave me what I wanted for the car also.
Yeah.
So I sold him the car, and when I took it to his house, he lived out in Martinsville. And he has become a good friend of mine, just like you know, in the car hobby. And he had this Cadillac in his garage. And I dropped it off, and I said, where do you want me to park it? He said, well, I'm going to be putting it right beside my Cadillac, but I got to go and talk to my wife because she's got to get her car out of the garage. So I'm like, well, I don't really want to be around for that conversation. So why don't you wait and show me this Cadillac? And he had it under a cover on jack stands, and he pulled the cover up, and I could see this gray ghost sitting underneath this cover, and I thought, God damn, that is absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
He only really pulled up a little bit of the cover so that I could see inside, and I glanced inside. I said, jeepers Mose, do you ever drive it? He said, well, once in a blue moon I take it out in the summers. He bought it from the original owner. He was just like us, but he doesn't really go to a lot of car shows or anything. So he goes to car shows, but he never displays his cars there. He just likes to keep them for himself. Same thing with this Cadillac. He said, I didn't really buy this car to drive it all the time. I just want something to look at while I'm having my coffee in the morning. So there the car sat. I said, well, if you ever take it out and drive it, I want to see it. And the following summer, he brought it over to my work. Just stopped in for a Friday afternoon visit. He was off work, and I walked around it, and I thought, wow, it was just a gorgeous car.
Yeah.
In perfect shape. Not a mark on it. Well, you saw it. And the car he bought was an original owner car that was ordered. So it was another one of those cases where the car didn't sit on the lot. It wasn't in the showroom. This car was actually ordered by the guy who, bought it and then owned it for the following 20 or 25 years.
Right.
And it was ordered in oyster gray was the color. And it had matching oyster gray leather interior. And it was a Brougham d'Elegance with seats that were about 3 feet thick. And they made that sound when you sat in the car that just went psh.
They were incredible. They were so triple overstuffed seats, basically.
Oh,
the
yeah.
softest leather ever.
Yep.
And this beautiful gray. And it's hard to describe what that gray is like. It's even the outside, but both the inside and the outside. Yep. It's the kind of gray or sort of silver gray that you would picture on a Rolls Royce.
It was just like that. It had metallic in it, but very little metallic.
Yeah.
It seemed like it was a very unique color.
And then the vinyl top was gray as well.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And then every piece of trim and piece of chrome, that was again a car that I don't know if there was a flaw on it anywhere.
No, there wasn't. And Cadillac in the 80s, of course, those cars were so ornamented. There was a little Cadillac crest everywhere you turned. There was a little Cadillac crest on it.
Yep.
They were on the sides of the seats, I remember, and in the steering wheel, and on every door had a very ornate crest with the logo and the crest in it. It was all chrome, and they were very, very well made, and that car was extremely well put together also. I never had a problem with that car.
That car had, do I remember this correctly, that had the power closing trunk?
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Now, some people remember those on, Camaros. They did those on Camaros in the 80s too. But basically, you set the trunk lid down, and it sort of clasps onto it and pulls it down tight.
There's a little motor that sucks it down. It's called the soft close.
Yeah.
It was an option, but it was standard on a Fleetwood d'Elegance, which that car was.
Right.
Yeah, and I bought it. So my dad saw that car once, when my friend was driving it. And he said, wow, he said, man, if you ever had a chance to own that, oh my God, I absolutely love that thing. I would just, man, tell him if he ever wants to sell it that I'll buy it.
Yeah.
And a Christmas was coming up fairly soon. And I just, in idle conversation, I mentioned to him, I said, if you ever want to sell that car, let me know. Because, Dad would love that car.
Yeah.
And I would love to. And I had gotten to know him by then. And he said, well, funny you should mention that because, my daughter's a teenager now and she's getting, we've gotten her into the horses. And he asked me if I had any idea how much it cost to keep a horse or how much time it consumed. He said, I'm not driving my Cadillac anymore. And, it costs a fortune to keep boarding horses and stuff. He said, so I'll sell it to you for what I've got into it. And I said, well, okay. So I bought that car in about the early November, just before we had our first snow, and I hid it in my garage. And that Christmas Eve, it was bitterly cold that year. I think we're going back to 2016.
Yep.
Ish. And I drove it over to Mom and Dad's house and backed it into Dad's driveway on Christmas Eve. And he was out walking, of all things, in the bitter cold. He was out getting his exercise. And, of course, he comes home and that Cadillac was sitting in the driveway. And I met him out there with a rum and Coke, and I said, Merry Christmas. He said, where did you, what, huh, what? So I gave him the car for Christmas. And we kept that car for about 3 years.
Yeah.
That was a beautiful car also.
That one was probably the most spectacular, I think, just in terms of the shape. Of the ones that I've seen, I haven't known you for your whole life, and I'm sure they've all been amazing. But that's really cool.
That was, of all the Cadillacs I've owned, I haven't really owned a lot of Cadillacs, but that was probably the best one. So I've had a couple of duds. Cadillacs are notoriously complicated to fix. It's like the Lincoln you were telling me about that with the wiring,
yes,
and the butt connectors. It's they're tough to kind of troubleshoot those little problems, but this car didn't have any problems. Nothing. The auto level worked. The powered soft close trunk worked.
Yeah.
The only thing I rebuilt on that car was the air conditioning. The air conditioning was original. The old R12 system was done. It was empty, and so I replaced everything.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
What's funny, I think, and maybe you remember this more than I do, just because you were there a bit more than I was. But that car in 1987. Was very regal. It was very luxurious, but sort of the very tail end of what was called luxurious in North America.
Oh, for sure.
It's funny to compare vehicles that were coming out at the same time, because now I find that, and everybody will say this, but if you look at cars in 2021, everything kind of looks the same. Mm-hmm. There's very much that sort of mentality. It's all SUVs, and you can buy Toyota, a Honda, you can buy a Mercedes, and you can go into the interiors, and there are differences, but you can get leather in both. You can get, there's a lot of comparables.
They're all black.
They're all black.
Yeah,
you can't get a color in an interior anymore, just about. But what I was going to say is that 87 Cadillac, kind of very square edges to it, very formal in its styling, and yet you can compare other things in 1987, even offered by General Motors, that were super aerodynamic and sleek. Mm-hmm. Had aircraft style doors that closed, not with these formal drip trim that was on that Cadillac. It's kind of funny how different things were in the same time period, just as cars were transitioning kind of from the style they had been from the 60s, 70s, and 80s to what then became what I would call sort of the mid 80s all the way through the 2000s. Sort of the jelly bean aerodynamics really came into play, that really started to change things.
Well, yeah,
and,
you're
and
right.
that Cadillac, that 87, was sort of the last sort of battle axe, you could sort of say.
Exactly. Cadillac and Lincoln even had a little rivalry. I was 20 years old in 1987, and I remember those cars when they were new. I can also remember the advertising campaigns. The Cadillac was just slightly bigger than a Lincoln, and they used to advertise the cars as the largest American luxury car on sale. Because it was just a little bit bigger than the Lincoln Town Car. And I owned a 1986 Lincoln Town Car way back in the 90s. And it was a nice car also, but really underpowered. The little 302 engine just didn't have enough.
Yeah.
For an 86 town car. The Cadillac was gutless also, but at least it had enough power to get out of its own way. Still had a V8 in it.
Yep.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, you got to remember too, they were appealing like with those, like an 87. I'm trying to think of a newer, smaller aerodynamic car from 87, like the Ford Taurus.
Well, the Taurus came out. That was one of the revolutionary ones from Ford. But think of like, even GM had the Berletta, or they had the Corsica that sort of came out in that era. Mm-hmm. They really started to make things aerodynamically shaped in that way. They changed, door mirrors went from being sort of stuck onto the sides to being blended in, things like that.
Right.
That really changed the shape. Door handles that were pushed into the sides of the car rather than stick out of the side of the car. Yep. All those things that they started to change. But it's kind of funny that in the same year, you had such a difference in those things. Whereas now, take any car that's new in 2020 or 2021, they're all pretty aerodynamic. They're all forced to be by, direction of fuel economy numbers.
Yep.
They meet pedestrian safety standards.
Yep,
so you can't have sharp edges. Like look at the car that you got in the garage or my classic car. I mean, you could dismember somebody with some of the edges that are on those vehicles.
Oh, absolutely.
You'd slice through people, right? Like that's reality of. And now, I mean, nobody wants to get hit by a car, but they've changed the shape of them, and there's rules, right? So it was kind of funny how those rules were all just sort of starting, but you still had square formal cars, and then you had these sleek things that were at the same time.
Well, you did, but you got to remember that manufacturers are building cars to appeal to certain people, especially certain demographics.
Yeah.
So you have your average car buyer in their 20s and 30s buying the modern swoopy cars. In 1987, the German cars were really getting popular, especially with that whole yuppie kind of culture that was coming up. The big business professionals, the era of junk bonds and Wall Street and making huge amounts of money. If you've ever seen the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, all of that actually took place in the late 1980s. Mm-hmm. But when you look at cars, I mean, cars like that Cadillac Brougham were marketed towards people who were later 60s, retired, wanted a big, comfortable, traditional luxury car.
And had money to spend on something like that, too.
Right. People were already starting to call luxury cars out, as... I'm going to say like when BMW was starting to get really popular in North America.
Yeah, and
Mercedes-Benz.
Yeah.
But a lot of traditional luxury car buyers didn't see those as luxury cars. I still don't see them as luxury cars. It's a performance sedan. It's not a luxury car. When I watch TV shows like Top Gear, I used to love watching Top Gear. I still do. I mean, what a great show.
Absolutely.
But they did some really silly comparisons, comparing an M5 to a 1975 Lincoln or Cadillac or something like that. That's not apples and oranges. It's more like strawberry shortcake and dog shit. Just because you're not comparing the same things,
Right. No, you're right though, and I guess it comes down to when they built those cars and where they're from. I mean, now the world is so global. I'll put it that way.
Right.
That a sports car from Germany and a sports car in the USA have almost become sort of the same thing.
The same car with a different
what Cadillac builds with their V brand. Cadillac's got for sale right now. Cadillac has the last V8 powered manual transmission sedan for sale.
Right.
They're not going to make the CTS-V after this year or the end of this generation. That'll be it. It'll be gone. But what I'm saying is, in the past, comparing that, we were talking about this. The creation of the freeways and the interstate system in the USA and certainly in Canada, all the highways that became paved.
Yeah.
It's straight lines. You get in a car, you point it in one direction, and you wake up on the other end, and you're still going in the same direction.
Exactly.
Right? So the idea was you wanted a big, soft, floating, relaxing car to drive. Yeah, in Europe, I mean, I've been there now. The roads are tight, narrow, curvy.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
It's a phenomenal place to drive, and Europeans, that's a general term, but Europeans created cars for their local area, right? They created cars, and when you compare the two of them, they are completely different, right?
Well, they really are. I've been to Europe. I've been to England a couple times.
Yep.
American cars are totally impractical in England because
Yes.
the roads are small. They're
Yeah.
narrow, and there's mews and other roads and streets. You can't drive a big Cadillac or something like that down those roads.
Yeah.
But you got to remember when Cadillacs were built in the 1970s, like you were saying, the interstate system was, kind of up and you can drive for hundreds of miles in basically a straight line
Yeah.
to get anywhere. They don't have distances like that especially in England,
And
the
the
entire country's only about the size of Saskatchewan.
And the reversal then is true too. A lot of European cars, when they're imported here, let's say, or they build them for North America, they oftentimes have bigger, stronger powertrains in them because a 1.2 liter 3-cylinder engine in a Volkswagen Polo just doesn't really have enough, to get over, say, the Rocky Mountains or to cruise at a comfortable pace or cruise comfortably at 70 miles an hour or 110 kilometers an hour. The poor little 3-banger's just screaming away.
Oh, for sure.
Whereas, you upgrade it with a 4-cylinder, a little bit bigger engine, gearing's a little different, and then calm the thing down so it can actually do the freeway speeds or highway speeds that, and things have now changed. That we're talking the past, right? Because now cars are just getting more and more the same, whether they're from Europe, they're from Asia, they're from North America, they're building them the same way. But interestingly enough, the luxury car has virtually, the thing that you and I kind of like the most, and I like lots of cars. I got a huge soft spot for Honda and for Japanese imports. What we've been talking about all day here is not the only thing I like.
Right.
But that kind of car, either you could say it's disappeared, or you could say it's just simply morphed into something else. And it's turned in maybe we could say it's turned into the big full-size crossover SUV now.
Right.
And I think of what's the big Buick now?
The big SUV is called the Enclave.
Enclave, yeah, that. Or, just take a Cadillac Escalade or pick an Acura MDX or, some big full-size vehicle like that. They kind of handle and drive like our old favorite American full-size cars did.
Well, they really do. And if you look at, what's the best-selling vehicle in North America right now?
The F-150.
It's the Ford F-150.
That's right.
So what is a Ford F-150? Well, it's a 20-foot-long vehicle with 4 doors that seats 6 with a gigantic trunk and a V8 engine.
And a full-size frame, body on frame.
Yeah,
right?
So you could say that a modern Ford F-150 is kind of a loose example of a 69 Buick Electra Limited.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Or a 77 Mercury Marquis. You've got seating for 6. You've got a huge trunk. You've got V8 power to cruise up and down mountain passes all day long.
That's right.
And a modern pickup truck, I drive them all the time at work. They get about 20 miles per gallon.
Yep.
My Delta 88 from 1983 gets a 6-passenger with a huge trunk. It gets about 20 miles per gallon.
It's true.
So how far have we really come? Because people are buying these big pickup trucks in droves. And we've just traded those cars for pickup trucks. That's all we've done.
We really have. And, there's plenty of big SUVs. As you're talking about the pickup truck, but, if we just talk about SUVs too, there's plenty of them.
Yes. That
really don't handle any better or much better, say on a slalom course, than a big old car would. They've improved, and their rides are great, but they are the modern equivalent. That F-150 or that truck or that big SUV kind of is the modern equivalent. It's not a sports car.
Yeah.
It's not great on fuel necessarily, right?
Right. Yeah.
And there are some exceptions to the rule. I know when you really go expensive and you talk about Audi SUVs, Mercedes-Benz, Porsche SUVs. Yeah, you can get SUVs that handle better than sports cars ever did from every bygone era, right? That's true. But that's not what everybody's buying. Those are, not sold in great numbers, right?
No, exactly.
But the average family vehicle now, it's just morphed. It's just sort of changed,
well, it's
right?
become an appliance, and the modern family almost demands it as people feel more and more entitled to stuff. It's just happens to be a part of your life.
Yeah.
Is that family car. And it's more a utilitarian thing, like your refrigerator in your kitchen. Nobody cares what it looks like as long as it works.
See?
Right?
And this brings us all back to the thing that I started talking about at the beginning. is, are we going to see anybody who took special care of their refrigerator
Well,
in 20 years, right? That's the big question, is if a lot of people see them that way. And I can see that. You know, you've got a Grand Caravan, you fill it full of 4 kids. It does a whole lot of work, and it's, you know, a good, reliable vehicle, and it gets used up. They get used up because that's what they're designed to do, is carry a bunch of family, a bunch of stuff, go on road trips, you know, go to soccer games. Well, they do their job.
In a lot of ways, I think they are. I think you're going to find in 20 years, cars of today, you're going to find the odd one that was kept, it was put away, whatever the story is, because every car has got its own little story, including the one that is going to get bought tomorrow. And it's funny, you'll go to a car show, and every so often, even nowadays, you'll see a car that, I mean, to me, they were throwaway cars.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of examples of the Chevy Malibu, those ones from the 80s, the 4-door ones.
Or a Chevy Vega. Just
the
before.
Chevy Chevette.
Yeah.
If a mint condition Chevy Chevette shows up at a car show, I'm going to go and look at it.
Yep.
You know why? Because I remember those cars fondly from when they were new.
Pintos, Pacers, Gremlins, Javelins, AMC Eagles, you know, like all that stuff that sort
Vegas,
of
you know,
disintegrated.
The list goes on and on and on of the cars that just never made it. They were simply driven to the ground because they weren't worth anything when they were 10 years old.
That's right.
You know?
But now you do still find the odd one that was that story you're talking about. One, you know, maybe older person, lady, man, kept it.
Oh, sure.
Stored it away, daily, you know, just drove it on Sundays, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny because just like you said, I'm actually a little more attracted at a car show to go see that than I am to see another 68 Camaro or another 65 Ford Mustang. You know?
Right, yeah.
Those are beautiful cars, don't get me wrong. And if you're into Camaros and Mustangs, good for you. And I think they're fantastic.
They're just so popular.
They are. Yeah. They are. And there is even being a Buick owner, I have a bit of envy of those Mustang and Camaro guys because when something breaks, they can go online and buy just about any part that they want.
Exactly.
You know, there's repops of everything. Buick world, it's sort of half there. You can buy some stuff, other stuff you got to scrounge for.
Yeah.
But then things like if you have a Chevette or a Vega, where do you get parts for that? Well, you know?
Yeah, almost impossible. Like you're not going to go and find it depends on the car, of course. A lot of those Chevettes came with those little Iron Duke 4-cylinder engines, and you can get a lot of the basic parts. But you know what? Like a rear bumper or body parts for a Chevette that haven't been either smashed or rusted out, you know, that would be really, really tough to find.
It would.
So that's why they're so unique, and they're very unique to look at. You know, at a car show, lots of the early ones had that ugly plaid interior, and,
which isn't ugly anymore. It's totally cool now.
It's just so retro. You look at it, it's like, oh god, it's so hideous. It's cool.
It's right. It's so ugly that it's cool now. You know, it totally is. I have a theory with this too. Is that, you know, the people who owned Cadillacs, Buicks, Lincolns, Chryslers, all that expensive stuff.
Yeah.
They were the ones who could do what we've talked about this whole show, is basically buy a car, drive it a little bit, dote on it, keep it. Chevettes and Ford Pintos and Escorts and those things, the people who bought them didn't have the money, didn't have the means to do that.
Yeah.
Right? And they weren't buying a car to keep it anyways. It was simply an appliance used up onto the next thing, right?
Right.
So then when you do find one now, it's just such a even more rare occurrence, right?
Right. Yeah.
I think it's just part of what the vehicle was when it was new, you know?
Exactly.
Just like there's a ton of vehicles now that I think of a Chevy Cobalt, you know?
That perfect example.
A Cavalier. My wife had a Cavalier when we were dating.
Yeah.
And it was a 95 two-door Cavalier. The first of the new body style that was really, really aerodynamic, kind of had the turn signals were sort of triangle shaped, you know?
Yeah.
Really sleek looking thing. Two-door coupe. And you know what? It's 15, 20 years later since she had it in high school. We actually, like, we see one on the road, we point one out.
Right.
Because they used to be everywhere. And now they disintegrated and they're gone.
And they're gone.
And so when you see one, you're like, wow, look, that sweetie, there's a Cavalier just like the one you used to have. But that happens once a year now.
Right.
Not every third stoplight like it was 10 or 20 years ago.
Oh, for sure.
So, but Mustangs from 15, 20 years ago, there's lots of them around.
Well, lots of people kept their Mustang, and they just liked those Mustangs. And that was kind of that first kind of classic collectible cars, or Mustangs and Camaros, and the value went up. So people started not hoarding them, but people started keeping them and looking after them.
Yeah, that's right.
They didn't do that so much with the family station wagon, for example. But it's very interesting, I've been out to Okotoks a number of years for their annual collector car auction.
Yeah.
And about 3 years ago, pre-pandemic, of course, I was out at Okotoks, and the most expensive car I saw sell there was a station wagon. It was a 1969 Chevrolet full-size Kingswood station wagon.
Yep.
Yellow. It had the wood planking down the sides, and it sold for $30,000.
Wow.
And I thought that was such a huge number. And half of the Mustangs out there never came close to that number for selling. So
I think, you seek what you cannot get. Basically, you can't buy a station wagon anymore, right?
It defines economics, simple economics,
Yeah.
supply and demand.
There are no station wagons to buy new, and there haven't been for a number of years now.
No.
Like, station wagons have pretty much ultimately disappeared. Although I would still call most of the SUVs we drive a station wagon on stilts. It's basically the same
They're
thing.
basically wagons, yeah.
But nonetheless, station wagons are making a huge comeback. Mm-hmm. Like they are, like you said, that auction worth a lot. And
Yeah.
there's now clubs dedicated to them, and there are people looking for them specifically. And they are, like you said, they were so utilitarian for a lot of their existence.
Right.
That, say somebody, and I'll give you an example. I read an article in a magazine recently where this 58 Buick Limited Caballero wagon, and I mean, it's worth a fortune.
Right.
Because a lot of guys bought, 58 Buick Limited convertibles.
Right.
And that was, that's an awesome car to keep. A station wagon? Nah.
Yeah.
Right? But it was a luxury station wagon in 1958.
Of
and
course
now to
it was.
find one of those,
Yeah.
that is impossible.
It's a unicorn. There's
Yes.
the latest edition of Hemmings has got a 58,
Yep.
the restoration of this 58 Buick Caballero estate wagon.
Yep, that's the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, it's they're such unique cars, and they're so unique to look at. Also, and the fact of the matter is that most of them are all used up in demolition derbies or simply driven straight into the ground, and they are basically all gone. If you ever see a wagon in a demolition derby, chances are it was far beyond restoration, because anyone destroying one now in a demolition derby's got to have rocks in their head because they're selling it for 20 or 30 grand at auction.
That's right.
So
I got to say the coolest wagons, before we wrap the show up, the coolest wagons have got to be from GM and the clamshell wagons.
Clamshell wagons, those were awesome.
Man, I haven't seen many of them in person. I've watched some videos and stuff. I did see one at a car show probably 3-4 years back, pre-COVID and all that sort of thing. But just Google clamshell wagon. You basically stuck a key into the key slot on the one side of the back of the vehicle, and the glass disappeared into the tailgate.
The glass disappeared actually up into the roof.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, the glass went into the roof, and the gate went down underneath the floor.
It's so cool.
So that it just opened and closed like
a clam.
Like a clam. Just like a clamshell. Very cool. Friends of mine, when I was growing up, when I was a little kid, they had one. And my friends and I can remember getting into the back of that car because as little kids, you went to the back. You rode in the back of the station wagon.
That's right.
And it had a flip up. It was an Oldsmobile Custom Cruiser. And I'm going to say it was from 74, 75, 76.
Yep.
Like that. It was a clamshell wagon, dark green with the wood paneling down the side of it. Funny, I can remember every detail about that.
I know.
And yet I can't find my keys. I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning.
I know.
But that, Mr. Williams would go out there with a key and turn that thing, and you'd have to, as kids, you'd have to wait to get in the car because you had to wait for that whole mechanism to open up before you could get in. And and parents back then, of course, were all, my dad and all of those person of his generation were all fussy with the cars. That's just how I grew up anyway.
Yeah.
As kids, are your shoes clean? You were asked if your shoes were clean all the time, and no eating in the car. We got in there, we sat there, and we behaved ourselves. So, but you know what? That glass would stay up on a hot day. And I can remember ball caps and baseball glove once went out the back window.
Never to be found again.
Never to be found again. Somebody in the front would put the window down to smoke a cigarette, for example. And as soon as that flow of air came straight to the back and that back window was gone, you had a whoosh of air.
Yep.
And everything flew out the back if you didn't have it on tight. It was gone. So
I grew up in a station wagon too, a much newer station wagon, but a pair of them. My parents had an 89 Ford Taurus station wagon,
Okay.
the aerodynamic one. And then we had a 99 Ford Taurus station wagon, which was the really jelly bean kind.
yes, yeah.
And it was actually the second one, the 99, that had a third row of seating, rear facing out the back. And that was a lot of fun. You know, it really was. And I actually kind of got that car after I moved out of the house and things like that. And it was sort of mine for a few years, or a good number of years. And you know what? I like station wagons. I do. I got to admit, my wife hates them. That's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. But I like station wagons.
I would love to restore a station wagon. You know, we do a lot of vinyl wrap work in my business.
Yeah.
And you can I've seen examples of vinyl wrap where you can get the wood grain vinyl wrap.
Oh my gosh.
You can get it in any kind of flavor, like fir, light fir, dark mahogany, anything you can think of. And it's a vinyl wrap. Way back in the day, that stuff was so hard to apply. And on these older station wagons, it always cracks. It's like made out of Mac tack or something, whatever they call it back in the day. But you can even get neat designs, you know, with smoke or whatever, skulls, and it looks like wood grain.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Very, very cool. And I think it would be a great idea. And I know people are out there that have station wagons that I've seen the odd one for sale on Kijiji. They totally look restorable, and I would encourage anyone to restore a station wagon.
No kidding. Yeah, they are definitely getting popularity. It's wanting what you can't find or can't easily have, you know, and then that adds even more to the allure of it all.
Exactly.
A little bit
and
of that.
In 20 years, people say you should find and restore that Plymouth Voyager minivan that had the wood planking down the side of it, as crazy as that sounds.
Well, yeah, you're probably not wrong.
Yeah.
Because I remember riding around in those as a kid.
Yeah.
You know, and now to see one, they just aren't out there.
They're just not out there, and that's why they get attention. People want to see what they look like. The original minivans, you know?
Yeah, totally. Well, Tim, this has been a ton of fun. Thanks for your top 5, you know, cars that you've had and all the history and all that. And I'm sure we'll get you on again because you got more stories than we've got time for. So
I always love talking about cars with you, Jay. It's always turns into a great conversation.
It really does. It really does. So thanks a lot. Thanks for listening to us right now, by the way. We really appreciate all your time. Follow me in all kinds of places. You can find J. Thomas Auto on Facebook as well as Instagram, jthomasauto.ca, and subscribe to this podcast, Bald Tires, for lots more great stories like this to come. Thanks for listening to the Bald Tires Podcast. I'm Jay Thomas.